Oh, I know what I need to do.
Would you make it like a chopped salad?
that he was impeached for, namely incitement to insurrection. That is continuing incitement to the insurrection. The conduct described not only perpetuated his continuing offense, but also provides to us here today further decisive evidence of his intent to incite the insurrection in the first place. When my opposing counsel says that you should ignore the president's actions after the insurrection began, it's plainly wrong. And of course, to his outrageous,
Was what I was trying to say yesterday, is that an insurrection has to occur immediately after the speech. But it did. That was just a little interrupted.
They would accept your defense, perhaps, that it was all an accident. But on the other hand, the entire house
It's Joe Smith here, right?
Oh, really?
What's your name?
Hello. I'm waving to Deb in Rochester. How are things in Rochester?
Cold.
How much snow have you had the past week?
Not too much. This week,
All
we
right.
just had a few inches. We're supposed to, I think supposed to get more tonight and tomorrow. And then I heard on Tuesday, big storm possibly.
Oh, yeah, we had quite a bit. I don't know how many inches, but I'm just looking outside and
Are you out on the island? Yeah, I think you guys got hit harder than us.
yeah. When I'm in Rochester and my people downstate talk about you're in the snow belt and I say, ha ha, sometimes you get a lot more than we do.
And the difference is that we're prepared for it in Rochester.
Well, that's I always think of as an old joke. I remember Rochesterians say, we know how to drive in snow. And I say, yeah, south.
Yeah.
That's a good joke.
Oh. Hi, Jeremy, how are you?
All right, thanks. How's everybody?
Good. I'm out of one corner of my eye watching the floor of the Senate.
Yes, they're still arguing how many and
Actually, they just started closing arguments. They decided to admit a statement from the Republican representative who overheard the phone call with Trump.
Right.
That was admitted as evidence, and they're not calling witnesses. I think they proceeded with closing arguments.
oh wow. So just a written statement and that's it. I heard that.
They
might
read
be
it into the record.
that cuts things short.
So.
Okay, let me
And Sarah started the recording for me automatically, so I wouldn't forget today.
I see that. I'm just trying to make
My poor little brain gets overloaded sometimes.
trying to
By chomping on a delicious pancake, then
okay.
recorded.
Technically, yes.
I'm gonna probably take my camera off in a little bit so I can have lunch.
Please enjoy
I'm going to finish.
both
my-
of you. I'm for some reason struggling with
Sharing.
Yeah. Yeah. What?
I'll make sure you're okay before I take off my camera. Uh-oh, I think he's frozen. He might have to go out and come back in again.
Sorry, you lost me there for a moment.
Yeah.
Internet.
I was like, I didn't have my usual sound guy at synagogue this morning, so my fingers were like crossed all morning that we not have any technical difficulties, but we made it through. It was a quiet Shabbat. Well, for me, it was a quiet Shabbat. It was Rabbi likes to call it the Torah Shabbat.
What makes it a Torah Shabbat?
3 Torahs.
Oh, yes.
So he calls it the Japanese Shabbat, Torah. So,
but it's the Chinese New Year, not Japanese.
yeah. So it was busy up on the Bima, but it stayed quiet in the technical department. So that was good. Okay, so you're all good now. I'll be here, but I'm going to turn my camera off.
And
and my sound. But I'll watch, but I'm going to keep myself muted.
I'm just.
Yes, I forgot. I want to wish everybody a healthy, happy, and hearty Chinese New Year or Lunar New Year.
Absolutely. It's the year of the ox, which is my birth Chinese zodiac year. So I'm quite pleased. And it's also Adar, the Jewish month of joy. So I hope that being back together is a positive occasion for all of us. It's been a little while. And so what I thought I would do this week is to welcome us back and to kind of go back to the scope of what we've done so far and before taking us into this new section. And this new section will be dealing mostly with nationalism. In order to understand nationalism as a kind of challenge to peoplehood, that we're going to get into the notion of encumberedness and also what it means to address our physical needs first. We'll sort of do a practical application section talking about an ethical army and Israel's nation state law, but I will be candid. Those will be very short conversations. Oops, this is, I didn't mean to do that.
Isn't bothering you, is it?
No, you're good. The part B of between now and next class, I have to modify. I'll be honest and say I don't know what question I'm going to ask you. So here's where we're at. We spent 3 weeks talking about Jewish peoplehood, talking about what it meant to have the notion of Avram going from Ur of the Chaldees to Haran, so birthplace, his father's home, to a land that God would show, then to develop a kind of Zionist narrative where Israel is a kind of promised land, whether it was Canaan or Israel or Zion, and then to recognize the reality of diaspora and to try to figure out, so where are we today? Because Israel is a relatively new safe haven, and diaspora is, relatively speaking, for many of us, a safe haven. We then looked at well, so what's the content of our Jewish peoplehood? Is it based on ethnicity and just a kind of way of being in the world that has to do with our sort of birthright, or is it a set of beliefs and outcomes of those beliefs, the kind of morality and system of practice? And that brought us to the issue of universalism versus particularism, where there are aspects of Judaism that tell us and teach us to be concerned with the welfare of the world and others, but also to be concerned with ourselves. And where is the right balance of that? So we're going to bring all of those to bear on these different challenges to peoplehood. This week, nationalism, next week, anti-Semitism, and in the third week of this particular section, dual loyalties and our own identity politics, before we then in March try to come up with some new models. So review. Last time we were saying that the problem with looking at universalism and particularism as a dichotomy is that universalists tend to say that they're the moral ones while particularists are selfish. Or by contrast, that particularists are loyal and committed to something meaningful, their own people, their own family, while universalists like just assimilate or away and are unengaged from the sort of concerns of their local community. Those are false dichotomies and stereotypes. And the question is, right, how do we kind of avoid those extremes and have a path towards a sense of belonging that is not so dichotomous, not so extreme on either end. And nationalism is our first sort of answer to consider that in and of itself, nationalism is relatively new in the Jewish tradition, which is to say on the world stage, nationalism, qua nationalism, is something on the order of 200, 250 years old. Doesn't mean that the nation of Israel under any of the Davidic kings or dynasties may not have had a nationalist spirit, but what we think of as nationalism today is relatively new, based on the idea of a nation state. And the question is will that work? Will nationalism work? And for Jews, it's complicated because in Israel, typically nationalism is seen as a good thing, right? And in America, typically, so this is tricky, especially in the last 4 years, typically Jews in America have felt that nationalism is dangerous because it leads to fascism or ultranationalism, as embodied by white supremacy in particular. Okay, that is not to say that there aren't Israelis who, don't care about the rest of the world or their neighbors. That's far from the truth, but the sort of communal dialogue and instinct in Israel generally presumes that nationalism has something to offer. And in America, for the last 50 years, nationalism has been something, again, that we've seen as something potentially dangerous for Jews. Now, again, plenty of Jews have American nationalist tendencies or beliefs or voting patterns even. So this is not like a hard and fast statement, but it's a kind of general sense to put on the table, which is to say, again, for Jews, what nationalism is and looks like for the Jewish people is complicated. Generally speaking, both the American Jewish community and Israel's Jewish community are challenged by ultra-natural nationalism. In Israel, the right wing of Israeli politics, whether it's the settler movement or ultra-Orthodox parties, right, have proven to be problematic for the center or the vast majority of the Israeli population. Forgetting about, by the way, 20% of the Israeli population being Arab, like for the 80% of Israel that it's Jewish, right? When right-wing settler movement parties, in terms of politics, or right-wing religious parties, the ultra-Orthodox, take action or take the stage, generally the majority of Israeli Jews find it problematic. And in America, again, ultranationalism, particularly as expressed in white supremacy, has always been seen as bad for the Jews, dangerous for Jews, giving rise to anti-Semitism, like we saw in Charlottesville, and in certain of the participants of the January 6th insurrection. That being said, just like when things are calm and not like ultra political, Israeli nationalism is also typically challenged more by individualism than globalism. Israel's participation on the global stage economically and whatever else tends not to be about justice or about kind of like blending into the I'm going to say the League of Nations, not the organization that preceded the United Nations, but the sort of like idea of the community of nations. That tends not to be so much the divisive issue, a wedge issue, but individualism does. So the degree to which the Likud party, aside from its security standpoints and policies, when it was driving a lot of capitalist and market sort of like neoconservative political and economic policies, that was seen as making being an Israeli people a more challenging idea. And by the way, the same thing is true on the left in Israel, that when certain individuals took a kind of moral stance against the army and refused to serve, they were conscientious objectors, or they accepted that they were going to be drafted, but then they would do something to kind of ruin their service, whether it was going AWOL or something else. So those cases got a lot of press in Israel because they were seen as people separating themselves as individuals, right, from that which makes the state a community, a place of belonging, a people, whether it's like the Israeli people or the Jewish people. So that's been their primary, like, again, when things are calm, challenge. And American nationalism, regardless of the Jews, you know, as we really kind of like came awake to, if we weren't aware before, in the last 4 years, or in the 2016 election cycle, and again in 2020, the way in which Trump in particular used or generated populist fervor over the issue of globalization and globalism. Globalism is seen as something bad. So we should be Americans on the global stage and not, you know, humans who are part of a global enterprise. And those who think of themselves as more citizens of the world than Americans somehow endanger what it means to be American. Okay? You don't have to agree with these things, but this is a sort of like, again, this is the challenge that those isms present to the idea of what it means to belong to a people. And again, we're addressing that partly because we're assuming that Jewish peoplehood is a good thing. And also when we evaluate nationalism as a way of maintaining peoplehood, right? How does nationalism address the individual versus the global identity? How does it address tendencies towards whatever fascism or ultranationalism might look like? Are you following me so far?
Yeah, Rabbi,
Yes.
When we talk about those in Israel who refuse to serve in the army, such a mixed bag of motivation behind that. I'm not sure that it can be easily called just individualism. I mean, on the one hand, you have the ultra-Orthodox that just simply believe that
Right.
you know, studying in yeshiva is more important to the welfare of the state. But on the other side, you have those that are not opposed to Israel as a country and the creation of a national country for the Jews, but have strong moral difficulties with the policies that the country is carrying out.
Absolutely. And I should say, so thank you for the corrective. I did not mean the ultra-Orthodox refusal to participate in the army, because that's more of a kind of communal refusal. And so it gets, it doesn't get pressed because it's like an assumption, actually. It is an issue that comes up. But through the 90s and the aughts, there were, again, these isolated cases of particular individuals, conscientious objectors to army service from the secular world, typically, who refused even national service, which is to say that, like, for those who really do feel like, as you were expressing, that Israel is, you know, a good or a great country, and they support the existence of the state. They have issues with the army and the government policies that the army is asked to kind of implement. They are given the opportunity to go into national service, kind of like our AmeriCorps. So I'm speaking of individuals who refused even that because of the whole notion of what it means to be drafted into some kind of national conglomeration. So I wasn't careful in my language, and I appreciate the qualification, and because you were absolutely right. Was there more? No. Okay. So what I want to do before we kind of get too far and then begin to address our sources is to kind of revisit this question that we asked towards the end of last time. Can you really have a balance between the universal and the particular? And if you try to have that balance and conditions change, is the conditional kind of like, oh, I'm going to give a little bit more weight to self-protection, or I'm going to give a little bit more weight to kind of helping the universal? Does that really hold? Or do we need to kind of have some kind of synthesis? And I was driving us towards this idea that some kind of synthesis is really the way to go. The one thing I want to kind of like point out is that Daniel Hartman in particular, and in the video, he tries to get to sort of the why. His synthesis of universal and particular seems to come through nationalism. Okay, so I borrowed this term from a colleague who works at Hartman, menschlich nationalism. This is our aim. And the question is, you know, can we really do this? And what's Jewish about this? Okay, so I know there's a lot of color here. So let me do the color coding. Blue is seen as positive. White is neutral, and the gray is, or the black is seen as like a negative, or a kind of like a caution. Okay, or something to be cautious about. So one of the things that comes up in the lecture, and to a certain degree in the interview, is that a nationalism that, no, let me rephrase that. If you're going to have nationalism because it is a positive political organizing feature of the modern era, meaning that, like, if you want to get beyond, say, like the tribalism of Assyria, or of Afghanistan, or I don't know about Iraq so much anymore, but like if you want to kind of like bring all those peoples into some kind of cooperative system where each of their, like, not family, but larger than family relationships are able to provide for mutual interest in addition to their own, you're probably going to end up with something that looks like a nation state. Okay, so the degree to which nationalism can take multiple tribes or ethnic groupings and bring them together into a cooperative system, and by the way, that if we're going to do this on the global stage, like to do it by nation, like, or by state, you know, then nationalism is good. Okay, which is to say that a nation, or again, tribes coming together, are going to be looking for ways to serve their interests. And it's not wrong to do that. It is appropriate. The question becomes, when are you prioritizing your interests over the interests of, say, another nation or another people? So, when should America be advocating for manufacturing to take place in the United States versus in China, right? And it's appropriate for America to be looking after American interests, right? Understanding that it's also in relationship to China, and China's doing the same thing. And is it okay to cheat or not cheat, right? That's the big thing that's been going on in our trade agreements or lack thereof. So prioritizing one's interests is appropriate, right? The question then becomes, though, like, when in prioritizing America or Israel or any particular nation, are you excluding others, right? So I cannot avoid what will sound political. I'm not advocating, I'm just using this as a demonstration, right? Refugees who show up at the United States, right, at any of our points of entry, legally, should they be allowed in or not, right? Again, if they're going through legal means, then great, but is there a limit? What should that limit be? So, for example, the Biden administration, I think, just raised the limit to 125,000 refugees annually. And I will tell you that in my school that I used to run, we had a refugee family. And I cannot imagine not letting that family into the United States, right? However much we might want Americans to get American jobs and all those things, to put our American priorities first, to exclude this individual, right, would be like an act of discrimination. And I'll demonstrate to you why. So again, having some sort of priority that there is a limit, but like he would fit within that limit, great. Why? Here is an Afghan who is Muslim, okay, but who is fleeing Afghanistan because he's afraid of the Taliban. Why? Because he was an interpreter for the American Armed Forces, and he was a translator. And he knew that because of his service to the American Armed Forces, that he and his family were in danger. So he applied for refugee status. He was given it, and through the refugee program that was in existence at the end of the Obama administration, he arrived, and there were all sorts of government funds and community efforts, right, to welcome him and his family. So much so that the Jewish community ended up in partnership with some churches, supporting the family in terms of their home life. But he had 2 daughters, and one was going to be in the early childhood center at the JCC, paid for by a donor and in cooperation with Jewish Family Services. And the older daughter started in the public system and was failing, or the system was failing her. And so because of our connections to the Jewish community, somebody asked if she could come to the day school. And we had to figure out what supports she needed in terms of English and whatever else. But again, with the donor's support, we were able to say, someone's paying the tuition, absolutely, let's make it happen. And I have to tell you, every Veterans Day that we brought him to come speak to the students about his buddies who had served in the armed forces and what they were doing in Afghanistan, truly moving, right? So yeah, let's include him as opposed to excluding him, even though on paper he's Muslim, he's Afghani, and so you might assume that he's not going to contribute. But instead, actually, at this point, not only are they tax-paying citizens and whatever else, but like well employed and giving back to the community as well. I think I did that without making it to Republican versus Democrat. Okay, so that's one level of what would make a nationalism kind of menschlich, to say, yes, I have particular priorities, but I'm not going to go so far as to exclude others. Next level, it's okay to advocate for loyalty, devotion, identification to the nation, right? We're going to say the Pledge of Allegiance, and we're going to sing, the national anthem, or it's going to play at our sports events, which the Dallas Mavericks was apparently an issue recently, and that's appropriate, right? Because it gives us a sense of identity. It helps us to form a narrative of what it means to be American. But if you exalt the nation, if you make it so that it's only about America, then we get into some fascist trouble. So like, what did Hitler do, right? He kind of took this sort of socialist democratic process by which he got elected to office. And then he said, it's not just Germany first, it's that other people are bad, and we need to, through Anschluss, like we're going to expand the Reich and recover, a sense of Aryan supremacy, and we're going to prove it. We're going to take over the country. That is exalting, right, the Third Reich over anything that was just German to begin with, and to do it in every scenario, as opposed to just saying like, oh, like when it comes to playing the national anthem, no one should be able to kneel. Okay, you could debate about whether that's like an exaltation or an advocacy. If that's the only way in which you are playing up what loyalty looks like, right? But really, when you are kind of making people like not just pledge allegiance, but like pledge to the Führer, that's a whole different level of nationalism, and that nationalism we call fascism or ultranationalism. Other menschlich aspects of nationalism, or that could be menschlich, is to recognize that like, look, we all come from some kind of background. We come from a particular family, maybe generations of a family, or a community, or a geographic location, and we have kind of our own loyalties and devotions to that help to generate a sense of ethnicity, and maybe we are Jewish Americans or American Jews, right? And maybe at any given time, one aspect of our identity within the nation becomes a larger issue. And how do we balance those? But like, to say like you can't be who you are, that where you've come from in terms of like your history shouldn't count in who you are in the nation, is to kind of like create a construct that doesn't live out. The reality is we all come from some sort of family. We're encumbered or burdened by that, usually in, at least Jewishly, we say in a positive way. And that's what helps us feel a sense of belonging. And then I'm gonna like tiptoe here, which is why it's in black and not in gray. The gray is like definitely bad. Like the degree to which we in America in particular, but it's true in nations around the world, especially first world and capitalist nations, the degree to which our narrative, our story of like what it means to be successful is like to pull ourselves up by the bootstraps and to have earned our way all by ourselves, and not to recognize anything that helped us get here, whether it's inheritance or the government building roads or wherever else it may be, that like our success is actually based on being part of a community. If we think it's only about ourselves, right, then even if that's the national narrative, right, it takes us away from a sense of peoplehood. It makes us, it's just out for ourselves. And it also pits us against each other in a kind of zero-sum game. So even though competition might be good in the marketplace, right, when you're talking about people, the more we see ourselves competing out of scarcity instead of like just trying to do better. I don't mean like better in terms of money, but like just improve the world or improve our particular product, again, at the expense of somebody else, then we get into a kind of sense in which like our nationalism has actually kind of got something within it that's going to hurt the sense of what makes us menschlich. And on the flip side, right, if we are so consumed with justice and being a light to the nations, and I'll go so far as to saying like bringing democracy to the world, right, then we might forget what that looks like here and what it means for us to be American or Jewish or Israeli. And so while we might want certain causes for righteousness and justice to know no national boundaries, right? We also have to be aware, right, that national identity often matters. And one of the big things about Israel and America, and not just Jewish Americans or American Jews, is this question of like, should Jews in America be telling Israel what its policies should be? Right? Like, we don't, by and large, vote in Israeli elections. We're not citizens yet. We could be if we decided to move there, right? And if we made Aliyah and then we came back to live here, but temporarily, we could still vote in elections in Israel. That is different than, hey, I was born and raised in America. I'm a Jew. I'm not making it Aliyah anytime soon. But let me tell you, Netanyahu, what you should be doing. And it's okay to like free speech, but to expect that to actually turn into policy is to ignore that like Israelis are sort of supposed to have like their own self-determination. So menschlich nationalism is one that's going to recognize, again, that whatever nation I'm a part of, I can't tell somebody else what to do who's in a different nation. I can have a dialogue, but I can't demand. That if I support individualism, it has to be kind of in support of the community. And I would do that because I understand that like we all come from people, and that it's good to kind of have a sense of something that brings us together, that we would advocate for, American values, Jewish values, Israeli values. And I'm being careful there. There's a difference between Jewish nationalism and Israeli nationalism, again, because 20% of the country of Israel is Arab, and there are Arabs who are pro-Israel, right? Like it's citizens who are pro. So just, what is Israeliness? And right, that what that looks like in a practical day-to-day issue is being able to prioritize self-interest, but not of just individuals, but of the collective, without going so far as to discriminate or to exclude. Questions on that? Very theoretical stuff. Yes.
In the first thing on your list here, prioritizing national interest, distinguishing its interests without excluding others. How do you deal, well, like you said, with economics, with competition? If you're prioritizing your own national interests, how do you handle, competition? How far, like you mentioned, do we cheat? And then you didn't say anything more about it.
No, and I'll be honest, like, first of all, like I'm not a political scientist. I'm not a politician. I'm not an economist, right? So like I'm trying to distill, again, it's sort of in a political philosophy kind of frame that the Jewish sources I think are going to speak to in some way, how to approach those questions. So do I think that we should steal intellectual property from other countries to advance our company's interests? So look, rabbinically, I'm going to say no, right? Because I think it's in the interests of our kind of collective that we're not encouraging that kind of competition where a company would do that to get ahead of another American company. So, for example, or likewise that like what America could mean to the community of nations would be to kind of create what I don't know, I guess, that's sort of like part of the Jewish communal enterprise that was also part of Zionism, the socialist Zionism, right? Like has filtered into my blood. It would be nice if we could build a world order where we would want to embody fair practices in the marketplace, such that kind of instead of the golden rule where like I treat others the way I would want to be treated, we might even go to the platinum rule, right? Which is like to treat somebody as they would want to be treated, right? So it's an interesting idea. I don't know if it actually works in economics and in business, right? But like the Chinese want to win. Great. American companies, and especially in tech, they want to win too, right? And if we could find a way that instead of like spying on each other, we were, let's say, I'm gonna stretch the truth here, which is to say, like, I don't know enough about the details, but let's just say, when it comes to science, around the world, in light of COVID-19, we were searching for a vaccine, and mRNA sequencing existed in ways for the last 3 to 5 years, I think. The science and pharma companies have been working on it that did not exist prior. So like, certainly with swine flu, we didn't have this kind of vaccination opportunity. Like it wasn't as dangerous, but like, forget it. Like we just, the tech wasn't there, right? At what point were we sharing that technology, whether it was American, British, Israeli, or Chinese? I don't know what other countries were actually rapidly in their pharmaceutical industries doing the research and developing vaccines. I think Russia developed its own vaccines as well, right? In a pandemic, it's better for us to share at least the science, right? And the difference between Johnson & Johnson and Moderna and Pfizer in terms of how cold it needs to be and why it has to be stored this way, like it matters in the end. So where do we cooperate? Where do we share information because it's better for everybody? And where is something like proprietary so that like, Pfizer is going to make the money, Moderna is going to make the money, Johnson & Johnson's going to make the money, or AstraZeneca, or the AstraZeneca one is really kind of tied to Oxford. So I don't care. I want the vaccine, right? And I hope everyone on this call, except for me, is getting at least their first shot because, right, that's going to be good for all of us. The same is not true about my cell phone. I know that, right? But like, where is that dividing line of like protecting my interests or advancing my interests, right, in a way that doesn't create conflict? And again, I don't have a precise answer, but that's how I would ask those questions. Does that work? All right, you'll take it for now. So let's see where Hartman and this sort of like synthesis of universal in particular comes from, to see if it helps inform, like, how did I get to those positions? Okay, and I hope I do. I hope I kind of show you where it comes from. So a quick word, the source book has sources that I'm not going to use, and I think there are 2 sources that I've put into my slideshow that are not in the source book. And if you're really interested in all of this sort of like, what is nationalism, fascism, and the debates about nationalism, the background reading is rich. It's got great scholarly material. But as I put in the last slide, like there are really only 3 pages I think are worth your extra time if you want to kind of play it out, for continued intellectual growth. So we're going to start here in Genesis chapter 2, remembering that in chapter 1, God created humanity at the end of the 7 days and placed us in the Garden of Eden, and that was sort of the end of the story. It was Shabbat. But shortly after, or actually shortly after, the story of creation is told again. And this time it begins right away with this idea that like, okay, Adam, before it's Adam and Eve. So like I refer to Adam here as earthling. Oops, that did not work. I need to get my annotation. Earthling. Oh, yeah. Why do I erase that? Good. I like to highlight. So where's my, I think this is my highlighter. Okay, so earthling. No, that didn't work. Take off the eraser. Sorry, I should know how to do this better. Here we go. Okay, so earthling. Here we go. Earthling is my translation of Adam until we get to down here, a man and his wife, right? So man, ish, and wife, ishto. It's a question whether that's isha, which means woman, because we do have woman here. Regardless, God puts all the animals and plants and whatever in front of Adam or Ha-Adam or the earthling, and Adam names them. And it's like amazing. Adam is like almost like a partner to God. But something is missing. Like Adam's not finding companionship with all of nature, which, you know, says something about, again, what it means to kind of understand the world through a social eye. Like when you're only by yourself, you can't even connect to your surroundings. Might be a reading of this passage. So God says, I'm going to make a fitting helper, Ezer Kenegdo, for, and I said for them, just to kind of keep it gender neutral, because again, even though Hebrew is in the masculine, it's not clear that at this stage, Adam is masculine. And here's the earthling giving names, but no fitting helper was found. Like the earthling went, cows, sheep, fish, but no companion. So God cast a sleep upon the earthling, and while Adam slept, God took a rib or some kind of siding and closed up the flesh and fashioned that rib into a woman. And then, right, what does Adam say? This one at last is bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. She is woman, from man she was taken, and this is it. So hence a man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife. So there's two things here. One is the assumption is from our text that men in particular, but humans, start in a nuclear family where they have parents. And the human thing to do is not to like leave your mother and father and go off on your own. The assumption is to leave your mother and father and go off and create your own family. Okay, so there's this like sense of like family is important to what it means to be human, or successful as a human, or fully matured in terms of what God intended, is to, again, cling to your spouse. Next slide. Really? Well, let me. Here we go. And this one's tough. There are two pieces to this story that Hartman likes to pull out. One is like, okay, so it's not just spouses one to the other, it's also siblings. And the story of Cain and Abel, right? The whole thing is like, yeah, Cain didn't recognize his obligation to his brother. Like he killed Abel, which goes pretty contrary to that. And so it's up to Seth, actually, and his descendants to kind of make it the case that where we have obligations to our siblings. And if you look at the book of Genesis with bookends, like the start of the story in some ways is not just creation, but it's Cain and Abel, where there is am I really my brother's keeper? Well, the answer was supposed to have been yes, but clearly it wasn't. To Joseph and his brothers, their reunion only succeeds because Judah says, no, 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 take me, not Benjamin. And it's then that Joseph is willing to forgive his brothers for having sold him into slavery and whatever else. So Judah recognizing, yes, I am my brother's keeper and I did wrong by Joseph, is when Joseph can say, I am your keeper too, and we're all going to live in Goshen and be happy in Egypt. So I'm not my brother's keeper is then by the end of the whole book answered, yes, you are. Okay, so that's one layer, sibling belonging. That being said, like in the context of belonging, there's going to be some jealousy. Like Cain wanted God to recognize his sacrifice, but God liked Abel's better. You know, there's going to be favoritism. So Jacob and Esau are fighting for, you know, Rebecca and Isaac's attention, and Joseph getting, you know, Jacob's love because he reminded Jacob of Rachel, his mother. Didn't sit well with his brothers, but of course, neither did his bragging about his dreams where they were going to bow to him, right? Like jealousy and that kind of like tension between interests, of course, is human. But what allows us to bridge those interests is that we belong to a family. The expectation is we should be able to figure it out. And again, where it's the beginning of Genesis, and even in the middle, doesn't always work out. The ending of Genesis is that we figured it out, right? And then that way in Exodus, we can become a nation because the tribes have learned to get together. So much so, and I didn't bring you this particular text, in Numbers when the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh ask, because of all their cattle, if they can stay on the other side of the Jordan. They say, Moses, it's good over here. Like, do we have to go into Canaan? And Moses is like, let me think about it. I hear you. It makes sense. But if there's ever a war that any of your, you know, tribal ancestral family, so any of the other 10 nations or 10 tribes, if they need you, you have to go fight with them. That's the deal, right? Because yeah, you can look out for your own interests, but you still are part of a collective, right? So let me go back to like that it's not just a spouse, that there are these assumptions of family, and then I'll stop again a little bit later to see if you have questions. At the flood, Noah's the righteous person. It doesn't say anything about his wife being righteous, his sons being righteous. In fact, Ham is seen as like very questionably amoral or immoral, right? So like it's Shem and Japhet who do the right thing, right? And that's why we're Semites after Shem. And Japhet is like the predecessor of the Greeks and the Romans. So like, okay, but it only talked about Noah. Wait, I skipped ahead here. It only talked about Noah. And nevertheless, God says, you shall enter the ark with your sons, with your sons. Let me read this as well, right? You shall enter the ark with your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives. The assumption is everybody gets to come along, right, with the people who are associated with them. That no person is an island, okay? And Noah's righteousness extends to his family. The same thing is true in our next text, where, because we have to come back to this text every time. This is not 1 through 3, this is actually 1 through 5. 1 through 5. So the Lord said to Avram, Lech Lecha. I mean, literally every week we look at this text, right? But if we look at now verse 5, Avram took his wife Sarai, and his brother's son Lot. He took his nephew with him. What? Why? If it's all about God and Avram, is Avram suddenly taking Sarai and his nephew? Like, okay, maybe his wife because Noah got to bring his wife, but like his nephew? Okay, partly because we mentioned a lot, like in the generations that were just before, but like, no, it's because the Jewish understanding of what it means to be human is to have family, right? And to have obligations to them. And it goes even further. Look at the rest of this verse. All the wealth, okay, great, bring the money, bring the flocks, because they were sort of shepherdish, and the persons they had acquired in Haran. And by acquired, it doesn't mean bought, it doesn't mean slaves, or at least the rabbis don't understand it that way. It's people who they taught about God and monotheism, and who were progenitors of like what would end up being the Jewish faith, right? When it comes to marrying off their son Isaac, yes, they'll go back to their families of origin to find a wife. But right, in terms of like who's running the farm and who's the community that they're living in, it's all these people together, the believers, if you will, a community of belonging. And in Leviticus, we get like a really beautiful demonstration of it. So there are these layers, and it grows verse by verse. Okay, so I'll do it in the English, but the Hebrew is just, it's beautiful. So like, don't hate your brother, your achicha, your ach, right? Your in your heart, you should reprove, reprimand, somehow, call out your kinsman. It's really a member of your people. Okay, so this again, is more like people, and countrymen may be overstating the case because we don't have a state necessarily, but like the populace of your people, so not necessarily citizens, but like born of your people, right? Don't take vengeance or bear grudge against them, and then ve'ahavta l'orecha kamocha, love your neighbor as yourself. So who is your neighbor? They're not your brethren, they're not a member of your people, they're not the children of your people, they're not the extended family of your people, right? They're the sort of like neighbor who's like associated with your community, but is not a member of your kind of like ethnic identity. Okay, because there's a step further. When a stranger resides with you in your land, don't wrong the stranger. So look, your neighbor is somebody who, they're not part of your ethnicity, but they're part of your community. Like they live with you, like, or near you, right? And then there are people who come from the outside, and like they're seeking refuge, or they wherever they came from, they want to be a part of what you are, and so they're not fully absorbed into your into your people, and they're not yet either, right, absorbed into your neighbor, that you would just treat them like your neighbor. The stranger who resides should be as one of your citizens. You're going to give that stranger a citizenship level, a kind of civic responsibility, ability to participate as a part of the political community, not necessarily the social community, but the political community. You shall ve'ahavta lo kamocha. You're going to love him as yourself, right? Because you were slaves in Egypt. So out of your own, again, particular story of having been a stranger, a foreigner in Egypt, and not been allowed to kind of be neighbors to the Egyptians, like we were a separate community, kind of like apartheid, but that's like a bad use of the word here. Very just like a state within a state. Because of our experience being that way, we want to love this stranger, this foreigner, as a member of our at least political arrangement. Okay, and that brings us to a text from last week, or last time, sorry, not last week, where, right, if you're going to lend money, you lend to your people. If it's between the poor person and oh, sorry, not the poor and the rich. If it's, you're someone who's related to you versus someone who's not Jewish, then you're going to give to the Jew first. If it's someone who, if there's the poor and the rich, the poor person takes precedence because they need it more. But if it's a poor from your town versus a poor from another town, you're going to give to the poor from your town first, right? certain level of interest is appropriate. And where does that take us to? Oh, this text. I like this text a lot. Let me pause though before. Are you following this sort of gradation of belonging? Neil, you're good? Okay, so here's an interesting case. It's not enough just to belong. And it's not enough just to like serve your self-interest. What it means to belong is to take responsibility. And so it is that in the Talmud, Rav and Rabbi Chanina and Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Chaviva, and the ellipsis is actually like the names sometimes change. I took that part out. Taught that anyone who has the ability to protest the sinful conduct of members of his own household and did not protest, he should be apprehended for the members, for whatever it is, the wrongdoing that the people in his house did, right? So if you see somebody in your household, in your larger family, who's doing something wrong and you don't protest, you don't stop them, you are responsible, okay? The same thing, by the way, though, for people of your town. If you don't stop the people of your town, you too should be apprehended. And in fact, for the whole world, that's a pretty big extension. If you have the opportunity to protest, you should protest. You should rebuke that person. You should stop them if you can. Okay. And in case that feels like too big, it is the case that, and we've seen this in history, it wasn't just in the time of the Talmud, but whenever Jews were kind of like hosted by a lord or a duke or a king of a particular, usually European city, town, whatever, if a Jew did something bad, right, the court Jew, whoever was kind of highest up in the community, would get called in, have to pay a ransom, have to like speak for that person, or otherwise pay a penalty for the whole Jewish community, right, because of one random Jew's bad act. But even in the time of the Talmud, the exilarch would, or the household of the exilarch, somebody from the exilarch's family would be, imprisoned or sent to jail or whatever for sins that took place, even right beyond the Jewish community of Babylonia to the whole world. As it's indicated, the Lord will enter into judgment the elders of God's people and its princes, saying, "It is you who have eaten up the vineyard, the robbery of the poor is in your house," right? That's all from Isaiah. So if the princes sinned by committing robbery, what did the elders do that was a sin, right? It's saying like they should have stopped the princes, the elders, the rabbis, the sages, or the exilarch should have told the princes stop. So God enters judgment with the elders because they didn't protest the sinful conduct. So again, it's not just like looking out for interest, it's also stopping bad behavior. We have that kind of responsibility. And since we're talking about the exilarch, this is a text we looked at before, but I just want to kind of give it a different color. Even when we live somewhere else, and yes, our sort of loyalty and devotion should be to our Jewish community, right, in Babylonia, right? What does Jeremiah say to us? Build houses, live in them, plant gardens, eat their fruit, take wives, beget sons and daughters, take wives for your sons, give your daughters to husbands that they may, right? We're going to multiply. We're going to expand our family, maybe, by the way, by intermarrying. That's not exactly clear from the text. But we're going to take care of ourselves. We're going to grow and prosper for ourselves, right? And how? Also by seeking the welfare of the city. And here, this kind of city is really like the ancient city-states, so like Athens or Sparta were kind of countries. What did it mean to be a city? Was it to be almost like a nation? So seek the welfare of the city to which God has exiled you, and pray to the Lord on its behalf. So yay, Babylonia, go Cyrus, like we like you. Because when that place prospers, so will we. So, right, we have to put our provincial interests in a little bit of a box to recognize that, like, when we also take care of the container for that interest, right, then we're going to also, our our interest or our prosperity is bound up with that larger prosperity. Questions on all of that? No. All right. Next, it's important to understand what this is to like have interests. Like, where does that come from? So yes, what it means to be human is fully recognized by the Jewish tradition in terms of like that we have desires. We have like, sort of Freudian superego, ego, id. The id needs to be satisfied. And I don't just mean sex, I mean like building and succeeding and achieving and all that stuff that then might feed our ego, right? But, right, where does the superego, where does morality kind of fit on top of that? So we just talked about what it meant to like understand that we come from and belong to at least a family. That family is part of a people. The people has like an extension of countrymen, we'll call it. And next to our countrymen are going to be neighbors, and foreigners may come to join our community as well. And we can have citizenship for all of those people. All of those people can be citizens because we're all bound to each other in a certain way. And so much so that like really we have a job to protest when somebody's doing something wrong. But as individuals, right, it's important to understand that interests are, it's normal, like to kind of seek this sort of communal protection and prosperity. Makes sense. Why? Because even in the Garden of Eden, we had food. God made sure that every tree that would grow right, that had pleasing, every tree that was pleasing to the sight and good for food, God caused to grow. Okay, great. So we have food. And there's also the tree of life. We don't know so much about the tree of life, by the way, but like, let's just pretend like it's good. Okay. And there's the tree of knowledge. And what I think is interesting here is like the text talks about all three trees. The first tree, kind of due to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, is food. And maybe also beauty, right? And beyond that, some kind of sense of maybe immortality or kind of extension of our life, right? Something, right? And a highest level knowledge. We're going to come back to that. When God is trying, or Moses is trying to sell the new generation on what it means to get to go to Israel, what does Moses talk about? Oh, God is bringing you to a good land with streams and springs and fountains, so there's going to be water, a land of wheat and barley, vine, figs, pomegranates, olive trees, and honey, the Shivat Minim, right? The 7 species. You may eat food without stint where you'll lack nothing. So like, why are we going to Israel? Because our needs will be seen to. But, or not so much but like as an extension of that, when you've eaten your fill, we should give thanks. So right, recognizing that our needs will be attended to, it's all part of like, that's normal, right? Once they're attended to, then we should be able to be in a position to express gratitude. So much so that like in a kind of messianic vision, but this is really more about coming back from exile, right? This is supposed to be a haftarah. This comes from Re'eh, the haftarah for Re'eh, the haftarah of comfort. This is the third of the haftarah of comfort, I think. All who are thirsty, come for water. If you have no money, come buy food and eat. Buy food without money, wine and milk without cost, right? It's appropriate to need and want food. But don't spend money for that which is not bread, or things that don't satisfy you. Pay attention to God, give heed to me, and you'll have choice food, the richest viands. If you incline your ear and come to me, hearken, you shall be revived. So now we get this like language that was implicit in Deuteronomy, right? If we're in relationship with God, or if we can get our food needs seen to, if we act out of desire for those needs, right? We should be able to enter into a relationship to God. So now we're going beyond our peoplehood and even to our like citizenry, to the divine. So much so, right? This is another verse that we saw before. right? We'll be able to sit under a grapevine and fig tree. No one will make us tremble. We won't be afraid, right? When it is, right, that God, that Torah goes out from Zion, that people learn what I've been trying to show you, right? That it's okay to have needs, but that we also have to kind of stop people from wrongdoing. And if we have our needs attended to, it should give us an attitude of gratitude. It's a cute little phrase that we teach the kindergartners, the attitude of gratitude, right? Then like those Torah teachings should lead us to something bigger, universal maybe, but at least divine. And God will adjudicate, and we can beat our swords into plowshares, spears into pruning hooks, right? So we can improve our crops, not be afraid, right? And this is the beauty of it. It doesn't say, Micah doesn't say that God says that everyone's going to believe in the God, right? All the peoples are going to walk each in the name of its gods. We'll walk in the name of the Lord, right? Because we're going to come from our own position, right? But in coming to the table, you know, we'll be able to interact with people who have different names for their gods. And what happens, according to Maimonides, when we make this into law? No families, no wars, no envy, no competition, right? For the good will be pervasive. So even Maimonides, who like wasn't so big on the fact that we had physical desires, and he's a doctor, he gets it, like he knows we need sustenance, right? But he's also an Aristotelian, so he's always trying to seek like the higher good. So he says like, okay, delicacies will be available, as readily available as dust. And then, so once we get those needs taken care of, then wise people will have understanding. They'll know the secrets of the world. For the earth shall be filled will be filled with knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. So he wants it to be like, okay, that's a stepping stone to knowing God. I know I'm going quickly here, but like, you know, some of it is just to kind of like, because these ideas are going to coalesce in a minute. That passage I read you from Deuteronomy were the verses that come immediately after this one, this section. So if God is saying, go to the land of Israel, it's got everything you need, 7 species of like all the kinds of fruits and water and sweetness and all the good stuff you need. What then should we make of the larger story? What can we learn? And so right before that, right before being told about food that might help us to be grateful, particularly in verse 3 here, but starting in verse 2, remember the long way the Lord your God has made you travel in the wilderness these past 40 years. Like God might test you by hardships to learn what was in your hearts, whether you would keep God's commandments or not. God subjected you to the hardship of hunger and then gave you manna to eat in order to teach you that humanity does not live on bread alone. Lo alechem levado. But the human may live on anything that the Lord decrees. So I mean, like, I put it after because it kind of takes us to another level. But this idea that we were slaves in Egypt so we could learn how to treat strangers. And then we wandered the desert so that we could appreciate what it meant to have our minimal food needs met, all so that we could learn that really, like, we're kind of dependent on God, and in that relationship to God, we would get this like bounty of the 7 species of produce and the streams and the land flowing with milk and honey. Okay, that sort of bread is just the start. Because what does Maimonides then codify as law for Torah study? Don't set your heart to acquire knowledge of Torah and wealth and honor simultaneously. You can't do Torah and business, right? At the same time. The way to leading to knowledge of Torah is a morsel of bread with salt, water by measure, and sleeping on the ground, a life of burden in order to like help with your study of Torah. You're not obliged to complete Torah study, but you can't get out of it. I mean, you're not obliged to complete it, but you still have to engage in it. And so again, it's this sort of like Torah and bread go together. You have to have that bread, and the more you can kind of like meet your minimum load on the physical, the more opportunity for the Torah stuff to come about. The more we see that our needs can be met, or when they're not being met, it's to teach us to kind of like also appreciate our being part of something bigger. The more we appreciate what we do have, and that balance of like appreciating what we have, understanding that, you know, even if we have, others might not, right? And all of that is part of this like larger universe, takes us again from our brethren to our people to our extended people plus our neighbors plus foreigners, all as part of the citizenry of our city. So before we try to apply any of this and then kind of see where we are, questions or comments? Okay, so the way the curriculum is laid out, and then for your own sort of like, you know, how you spend your time, I will tell you that Unit 4 is pretty good. And I took most of these texts from Unit 4. Some of them are also from Unit 5, which gets into the moral implications of peoplehood, of Jewish peoplehood. And that section actually ends with the code of ethics for the Israeli army. So I just want to say that, like, the fact that the Israeli army has a code of ethics says something. You don't even need to read it to know, right? That the way Israel dealt with this idea that, like, we need to protect ourselves in light of our tradition, in light of like this universalism versus particularism, in light of like, okay, but we can't enable a certain kind of ultranationalism, exclusion, discrimination to overtake how we conduct ourselves. So we're going to drop leaflets for the, you know, innocent Palestinians before we, you know, and some kind of invasion of Gaza, or we're going to attempt to arrest people rather than kill them, or and there's a very Hartman talks in the video about the case of I think he was an officer, but maybe he was just a soldier, who shot a wounded terrorist, so known terrorist, right? For whatever reason, the situation was such that the soldier thought that the terrorist posed a danger and shot him and killed him, and he was court-martialed because actually the terrorist was unarmed and maybe, you know, theoretically a danger, but the right thing to do in terms of the code of ethics was not to assume that this, you know, person with bad behavior, right, required that kind of justice. And if the army can't kind of put that cap on what was expressed as ultranationalism, again, not necessarily like out of malice, but just a kind of like keeping a lid on our emotions and our sense of loyalty and our sense of joy. Like, if it's such that we don't see the humanity of the people with whom we are dealing, again, even terrorists, then what will stop us? And so many people felt like the court-martialing and the punishment that was handed down were unfair, like in terms of process, in terms of everything. And a lot of people felt like, well, actually what happened was the punishment wasn't as severe as it would have been if that had not been a known terrorist, which is to say, like, the situation was taken, but the Israeli army wanted to, and listen to me, we, like, right? We, as Jews, we kind of feel this sort of tension, this like sense of belonging to this kind of approach that the Israeli army was trying to say, if we let it go, then it would give permission for X, Y, Z, right? And again, I truly am not saying this about the impeachment trial, but right, the degree to which the taking of the Michigan Capitol was a precursor for the insurrection at the Capitol, for the people who like were behind the scenes organizing, forget about who incited or whatever else, right? Like if you tolerate one, you don't know what else is going to come, right? When it comes to nationalism or ultranationalism. And so, you know, the Israeli army has this code of ethics that there's always a kind of like a border, a boundary, a lid on what might take us too far. It's 4 pages long. You're welcome to read it. I don't think it'll surprise you, but it's good to know that it's there. Okay, and then we get to something much more recent. 2018, Israel passed a basic law known as the nation state law. A basic law is a way of dealing with the fact that Israel doesn't have a constitution. There's Declaration of Independence, okay, but there's not like a kind of like, how do we kind of really do all of this? There's a lot of precedent, and what ended up happening is that the courts started to kind of neutralize a distinction between Jews and Palestinians as citizens, because that's what the law was saying, not because that's what like the judges felt. And so a certain portion of the Jewish Israeli population said we need to clarify that the Jewish people or Jewish peoplehood takes precedence. The ethnic majority, it's a Jewish state, like we need to just put that on paper very clearly, okay? But in saying it very clearly, they also kind of attempted to avoid a bigger argument and instead created that bigger argument by like not talking about Palestinians. So Hartman, and I give you a link to his like rewriting with options for language. Hartman said, like, would it have been so bad to have this clause to recognize, right, that Israel is the state for the Jewish people and other peoples, right, and its citizens? Even just saying that, right, would help this basic law seem less discriminatory. It's easy to read the law not as discriminating. It's easy to say, it's just prioritizing, right? But the way it feels to a 20% population might be different. And that could have been massaged, partly by politics, partly by language. But it really matters, right? Because in the place of a constitution, the relationship between the minority and the majority, like, we need some direction. And we can't just say the majority's preferences, needs, and priorities are gonna rule the day, period, end of story. We have to say, like, and there are other interests, right? So I'm gonna leave that for you to explore if you wish. There's an interesting question about settlements, which is that like Jewish expansion is supposed to be kind of promoted. And really, I just want you to know the people in the legislature, the Knesset who passed it, were thinking of the Negev, not of the West Bank, right? But like, shouldn't a Palestinian village be able to like build a hospital? And that the permission for that was missing. So Hartman tries to put it back in. And the last thing is what I call the Jewish question, which is like, okay, so in particular, for Jews who are the minority in a majority not Jewish population, country, whatever, how are we supposed to be? So I want to kind of put this out there, and then we can wrap up all this, you know, nationalism. We're not done with nationalism because we have anti-Semitism coming. So Herzl, I just like, he spends this whole first paragraph saying, we've tried so hard to be French and Austrian and German and British, right? And in vain, we are loyal patriots, sometimes super loyal, In vain do we make the same sacrifices of life and property as our fellow citizens. In vain we strive to enhance the fame of our native lands in the arts and sciences, or her wealth by trade and commerce, right? Even when we've lived there for centuries, we're decried as aliens, right? So then he goes back to his opening words. The Jews who will it shall achieve their state. Oh dear. We shall live at last as free men on our own soil, in our own homes, peacefully die. The world will be liberated by our freedom, enriched by our wealth, magnified by our greatness, right? So our fulfillment of our own self-interests will benefit the world. Whatever we attempt there for our own benefit will redound mightily and beneficially to the good of all mankind. So he's kind of carving out, particularly in that universalist Enlightenment nationalist space, at the end of the 19th century, when we hadn't quite dreamed of the League of Nations because we hadn't had World War I yet. How could we be more cosmopolitan? He says you have to be more Jewish, and when we take care of ourselves, that will help the world, because if we can help the minority see its needs achieved within a majority, or to become a majority that takes care of both itself and its minorities, then that will be good for the world. So I wouldn't call his Zionism a menschlich nationalism to start with, right? But as we've been showing, he kind of had embedded in his writings and in his teachings that we should aim for that. So what do you think? Like, can we have this menschlich nationalism? Is it easy? Is it hard? Does it feel Jewish?
Definitely not easy.
Right, definitely not easy. And I'm just going to put this out there. Like next week, when we talk about anti-Semitism, right, it's going to be like external nationalism, right? Like we're going to be identified as a nation or have to act nationally in some way or another because of the outside, right? How they treat us.
I mean, what's been happening is all of these questions have been laid out clearly and carefully, but there ain't no answers, or certainly no easy answers. All this, self-interest, world interest. How do we do that? There ain't no easy answer that I can see.
I like your position, because I think that like the larger goal here is really to see that there are a lot of meaningful ideas and values that kind of feed a sense of what Jewish peoplehood should be about, and they often compete, right? They can give us some guidance, but they don't answer every question. And as you pointed out, sometimes they create new questions that are even harder. Neil, any thoughts or questions?
Not really. I was sort of frustrated in the sense that we've gone through a long litany of source material and so forth and so on. We got about 5 minutes left to actually deal with the issues that are raised by them.
Yeah. So two things on that note. One is like next week I should have a little bit of time, like at the outset, maybe like our welcome back to each other, sort of like, what are you still thinking about from last week? It's challenging to bring you 3 units in one, and that there's sort of 2 litanies represent units 4 and 5 in large part, even though I tried to kind of bring them together. And I'll say this too, that like I felt for this part, kind of what Sid was saying, like there are no answers. So it's hard to kind of like, bring us full circle. but I hope it lingers, you know.
There never will be an answer to questions in which you have a spectrum of possibilities and there's nothing, neither part is all right or all wrong. And it's all really situational. And the main thing is to have a process that allows you to determine where you are at that point, which principles in light of our values will be are the guiding principles as opposed to the ones that we will of necessity have to dismiss in order to carry out that particular action. So there's never a single answer that says, nationalism is really where we need to be, or contrarily, globalism is where we need to be.
Right.
We always need to be balancing them.
Right.
When you were talking about trade and the economy, it wasn't a question of, at least in my mind, of whether stealing patent or stealing intellectual property is right or wrong. That on its face is wrong. That's theft.
Right.
But when you come to the question of are imposing tariffs in order to protect your own industry, is that right or wrong? Then that's where the questions come in.
That's a great point. Like I said, I'm not an economist or a political scientist. I forgot about tariffs. I appreciate what you're saying, and the different kinds of situations in which we might have to either balance these things or raise certain issues. And I guess I want to put out there that when we think about this curriculum at large, it's important to remember, right, that it was kind of written in 2018 and launched in 2019. So it's taken on new application and maybe in my attempt to use the same sources, but to speak to today, a little bit more challenging. When it came out, it felt like this notion of being encumbered, of being belonging to a family and having needs, that was not clear. Or we were only just coming to understand like that narrative, both in America and in Israel. And I think that Hartman really wanted, in some sense, the left to hear what it was that the right was saying that has a lot of legitimacy to it, even from the Jewish tradition, that I feel like maybe we take for granted today, because we've gotten to know what certain forms of nationalist expression look like that are maybe more ultranational. And we've come to understand those deep economic needs and insecurities that drive a certain kind of populism. Not that only poor people or out of work, white, whatever, blue collar workers were Trump voters. That's not at all what I'm saying, right? But like when we are not addressing that reality, right, then we're not addressing what it means to be human. And if we're not addressing the human, then we're definitely not going to get to any kind of like, a kind of universalism, because the particular is always going to be kind of a place of high need. But if we can get from high need to kind of like some sort of situation, then maybe our conversation will lead somewhere, and we'll have to see.
There is some good stuff in the readings there. I was skimming it this morning before we got started.
Good.
And I do want to go back and look in detail at both the code of ethics of the Army and the stuff that follows that, the national state law.
Yeah. So Neil, in particular, I encourage you to
Oh, there it is. You got that.
so to follow this link,
Mhm.
that I'll work with Sarah, who works at the Bethel office, to get this to you with the recording or whatever else on Monday, or maybe on Tuesday because of the holiday. But this text has parallel the nation state law, which is in your source book, and Daniel Hartman's commentary. And that particular video, he interviews a Palestinian and then an Israeli. The interview with the Palestinian is pretty helpful for understanding what was wrong with the nation state law. The interview with the Israeli Jewish scholar was very much like, it's a legal document. It's not meant to say anything about, the Palestinians at all. So I don't know that it's like worth your time unless you have a lot of it. That being said, though, the Unit 4 video I felt was very good. And in terms of some of the readings, Neil, that you might have looked at, like what is Martha Nussbaum trying to get across with a kind of like learning love and loyalty from your family that would then extend to nation or help you be a universalist, and what is like perhaps wrong with that. And this essay by Jill Lepore, the video for that unit 4, the beginning, he's talking a lot, but when he gets about halfway through his part, it gets really good. So for that 15-minute period that I kind of give you here in this slide, but the interviews are also kind of helpful for understanding, why is he so attached to this idea of being encumbered, of having some sense of belonging. And the New Americanism, she turned this essay into a book. It's a short book, but it's really moving about the history of teaching American nationalism and how we stopped teaching it when in the pretty much in the 80s, but maybe even earlier. And when we stopped teaching American nationalism, we kind of turned the dialogue in America into either globalism or ultranationalism, right? Whether or not you believed in either one, right? There was nothing to talk about because that was the only narrative. Now, I'm not saying like they're true, either one, right? But that was the discourse. And she's saying, so we need to put this back in the middle. What does American nationalism look like? And that would be more menschlich. So I hope it keeps you busy. I wish you a good Gung Hei Choi for the Chinese New Year. Happy Adar Misha Nichnas Adar Mervin B'Simcha. Good President's Day weekend, and for those of you who celebrate Valentine's, share the love.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.